So yesterday what did we do? We studied about the basic structure of plant cells, the different organelles in plant cells, the distinct features of plant cells, in what ways plant cells are different in terms of organelles and their functions. So now we will briefly go through how plants evolved and then what are the different types of plant tissues. Therefore, during evolutions how did the different types of tissues evolved, and then coming on to the leaf structure and then talking about the transports in roots and stems, which means the vascular bundles. So now talking about the evolutions of plant cells, why it is important, you will come to know how the structure of the plant cells changed during evolution. So now to begin with, they were non-vascular plants. So once they came from aquatic to the land, so the land plants which initially came in, they were non-vascular in nature. So when I say they were non-vascular in nature, what does that mean? Any idea? So the vascular bundle was missing, the vascular tissue, which as you said, it is xylem and phloem. So these plants therefore, in order to survive, so what would be the best way to survive? Now because the vascular bundle is missing, the mechanism to transport the water and minerals to long distances against gravity is missing. So then they will have to grow crawling at the level of the ground, and also even at the level of the ground to long distances, long lengths, they cannot survive, because then again the transport of minerals and water has to be longer. So therefore you will find them very close to water bodies where they can easily find. So like for example mosses, algae, so liverworts. So these kind of plants which were non-vascular in nature used to grow near the food source or the water source. Then with evolution, in order to survive higher order functions of survival, then they called vascular in nature. Vascular in nature, which means that getting the vascular bundle, xylem and phloem. So now conducting of water and minerals could happen. So then the initial ones were non-seed bearing plants. So through spores they used to have their progenies. So for example ferns, they are non-seed bearing plants. Then further evolution happened, they came to seed bearing plants. Now even in seed bearing plants they were angiosperms and gymnosperms. Angiosperms, if you remember, they do not have non-flowering plants. They have naked seeds, like for example conifers, pine trees. So the ovule does not have an ovary around it, there are no fruits. So the seeds are open. But then further evolution means where the seeds could be, the only way the seeds could be dispersed was the wind was the major mechanism. So but now when the fruits came in or the flowers came in, pollination, then fertilization could be long distances. So they could get genetically improved varieties. So then came the seed bearing plants or your flowering plants where the seeds could be encapsulated in fruits and all. So then we will talk about mainly about the vascular tissue. So now talking about the different tissues in the plant. So now what is a tissue? We have heard about tissues, we have heard about cells, then organs. So what is a tissue? It is somewhere between the cell and the organ. So tissue is nothing but when similar cells from the same origin come together to perform a specialized function. So then they form a tissue. When a number of tissues come together having or carrying out different functions in a functional manner, then they become an organ. So in plants there are different kinds of tissues. What are the different kinds of tissues? Dermal tissue, then ground tissue, then meristematic tissue and vascular tissue. So now let us talk about all these tissues. Dermal tissue. Dermal tissue, by the name itself, the skin of the plant. So they are composed of many different types of cells, but let us talk about the aerial parts and the ground parts. Now one kind of the dermal tissue is called epidermis, which you must have heard even during your school days. Now epidermis is mainly made up of parenchyma type of cells. Now for example in leaves they form the thin skin, that transparent layer which also sometimes these kind of cells at the epidermis is they also secrete a waxy layer which is called as cuticle. Now it serves the purpose of protecting or preventing the loss of water from the surface of the leaf or the stem. Then what else? One is epidermis. Now especially this you will find in non-woody plants or young plants. Then dermal tissue, when you talk about ground level, underground level, then the modifications into root hairs. Now roots, they form the epidermis on the roots form root hairs. There the purpose of epidermis, these long extensions or root small extensions of the epidermis is to increase the absorption capacity of the root, to absorb water and minerals, to enhance the uptake of water and minerals through these extensions. So there the epidermis is playing an extra role. Then on leaves and sometimes you will find wherever it is, depending on the location at which it is present on the plant, the function and the structure varies. Like for example, on the surface I said you will find cuticle. It is called as cuticle or the waxy layer or waxy compound generation. Now below the surface of the leaf, the entire leaf surface, you will find the epidermis will have large amount of pores or spaces which are called as stomata, and you will find guard cells which make these openings. Now this openings we have heard already, they are used for gas exchange and for the exchange of or for the water. So transpiration happens from there. So then in woody plants, epidermis is replaced by the dead cork cells. So when there are woody plants, rather than having thin skin, this thin skin gets modified into cork cells. Now cork cells are nothing but mature cells which are no longer growing and they become dead at maturity. The cytoplasm is lost, so they are only used for structural and protection purpose. So then the epidermis is modified into cork cells region. Talking about ground tissue is the mass of the plant. It forms the major flesh of the plant in the stem, the thickness. So this ground tissue, again majority of the cells in the ground tissues are parenchyma cells, and these cells they make up the ground tissue. Now they carry out many different kinds of functions. Now these parenchyma cells, because they can differentiate into different types of cells, so they can take part in various metabolic activities like in food storage, in synthesis, then in photosynthesis, which means preparing food, then what else, and in support, which means making the flesh, supporting the stem or the leaf. So that is how these, and in woody, non-woody roots, stems, leaves, they are primarily made up of ground tissue, non-woody plants. So vascular tissue system, now this is something which through evolution came in to the plant cells. Vascular tissue, there are two kinds of vascular tissues. One is the xylem and the phloem. Now xylem is what? Xylem is responsible for water conduction. Phloem is responsible for the food which is prepared in terms of carbohydrates or sugars, which is prepared in the leaves or the stems, is then transported through different parts of the plant. Now how does that happen? Now in roots, when we say xylem, now xylem contains different kinds of cells and phloem contains different kinds of cells which have specific structures to facilitate this process. Let's talk about the xylem. Now when the water gets absorbed onto the roots, now how do you think the water is able to get transported through the xylem against gravity till the leaves? It has to travel to the leaves where the photosynthesis is happening. So from where is that? One is the capillary action, but do you think capillary action would be enough to take it to the site of photosynthesis? There are such tall trees, so that creates a negative pressure in the xylem. Once the water, because of transpiration, gets evaporated, there is a pull for more water till the leaves. So there is a negative pressure in the xylem, and then the water is sucked up from the xylem for the photosynthesis in the leaves. So then again the roots to fill up, the adsorption takes place. Now one is that, what other do you think? When you say capillary action, what determines capillary action? What kind of forces?
Cohesive forces.
Cohesive, and what else? Cohesive and
Adhesive.
adhesive forces. So now, how do you think cohesive force in this and adhesive force in this is helping or facilitating the water movement in the xylem? This is called as cohesive tension theory. So I'll come on to that in the next slide. Let's talk about the different types of cells, then I'll be taking in detail. Now the different types of cells in xylem, there are two different types. One is called the vessel elements and the others are trichiads. So now vessel elements, these are nothing but columnar cells which have perforations at the top and the bottom. So they become like pipelines with no cytoplasm, empty chambers, lignified cells, thick cells with secondary walls. Also the water can travel easily. So these perforations, they are also called as perforated plates. So these are openings in the cells at the top and the bottom. Then this is vessel elements. Now trichiads are very long cells which become close to each other, long in length, and these are simple cells, but because of the length the water can diffuse through these cells and can pass. Again, these are dead cells upon maturity, so they become empty chambers and therefore they have stronger secondary walls, so similar to vessel elements. So then talking about phloem, it is the purpose is to transport sugar to different parts of the plants. So the type of cells which are responsible, these are called as sieve tube elements. Now the sugar to be transported through sieve tube element, these are again long cells. Now the sugar to be transported through sieve tube elements, how do you think the sugar sap is so thick? Once the sugar is prepared, how does the flow happen through these cells? It is not the site of synthesis of the sugar. So first the sugar from some site of synthesis, the cells which are preparing sugar where photosynthesis is taking place, the sugar has to be dropped into these sieve cells, and then from sieve tube elements, and then from there it has to be dropped back to the sink wherever sugar is needed. So how do you think this is happening? Sugar in the sieve tube elements to begin with is not present. So it can be through active transport or passive. So active when it is from higher, to the sink, it has to be transported to the sink. Passive, it can be from the source to the sieve tube elements. But then how in the sieve tube elements the flow is happening? It is lateral also, down also, up also. So how in the sieve tube elements the flow is happening? You will always find a hint. You will always find these vascular bundles together, the xylem and the phloem together. Why do you think it is so? Nature does everything for a purpose. It beautifully designs the structure. The flow of the sugar in these sieve tube elements is through hydrostatic pressure. So what happens when it is loaded onto the sieve tube elements, the sugar, the water, because of xylem is close to it, the water will flow where? From the xylem to the phloem. So once the water flows, then there will be hydrostatic pressure, then the sugar starts flowing. Now in order to pour it into a sink, even though active transport, or again this is facilitated by removal of water at the site. The water is again diffused back from those cells at the site to the xylem, so that the hydrostatic pressure can be reduced, and then the active transport can take place to put the sugars into the source cells. And what does it depend on? The loading and unloading. It depends in the sieve tube elements. There are we have heard about plasmodesmata. So it depends on the number of plasmodesmata, those connecting channels through which this transport happens. There are two patterns of growth. One is primary growth and the second is secondary growth. Primary growth, where elongation of the lengthening of the aerial parts or the underground parts is happening. So that is by the meristematic tissue only. So there are and not all throughout, like animals once, or mammals, once the growth has happened, we don't keep growing continuously. So but in plants the growth can happen till the plant is alive. Now, but it does not happen throughout the plant, it only happens in certain regions which are called as meristems. These are meristematic tissue regions which are composed of cells which are continuously dividing. So, it is the function of these tissues to increase the thickness or the length. Or even between the phloem and the xylem, there is another meristematic tissue which is called as vascular meristem, which further is rapidly dividing and then differentiates into either phloem or xylem and causes thickness there. So, now secondary growth is increasing the thickness. You will find it in especially woody plants. Those thick trunks which you see in the plants is because of secondary growth. That happens because of your lateral meristems or vascular meristem. So, as I said that it happens through the meristematic regions, that is what is there on this slide. And how do these meristematic tissues or these meristems divide? It is through mitosis, simple cell division. Now, because these meristematic cells, when we talk about totipotency in plant cells, it is because of these cells which have the ability to continuously divide and then differentiate into different types of tissues or different types of cells. Now, growth in meristems, as I was telling you, the apical meristem, then the lateral meristem is at the internodes or nodal, and there are rapid meristematic regions even between the nodes which will help in lengthening the internode. So, there are different kinds of, depending on wherever this meristem region is present, they support the either the elongation of the plant or the increase in the secondary growth. Talking about cambium, cambium is your vascular cambium. Now, this is a lateral meristem in the vascular plants, which means how does the xylem and the phloem of the cell keeps on increasing or gets rejuvenated, having more cells to it. So, now this happens because of the tissue, as I said, vascular meristem, which is present between xylem and the phloem, and it increases the size of the vascular cambium. Now, as I discussed, which process helps in the transport of water through the roots till the upper regions of the plant is diffusion. Now, for diffusion, what is the driving force?
Concentration gradient.
So, how do you think from the root, from the grounds, it is being sent to the through diffusion to the upper region? What will guide it? It is the concentration of other solute molecules or other substances present around, which will cause the water movement, which we call as osmosis. So, yesterday I was talking about plasmolysis. This is what you see in wilted leaves. Because of transpiration, water is lost, so it withdraws, the plasma membrane withdraws itself and they shrink. And if you put it in a hypotonic solution, these leaves, then they will become turgid because of the movement of water molecules from outside to the inside. And we know that cellular membranes, these are semi-permeable membranes, and water can easily move in through these semi-permeable membranes. Now, once the water is moving through the roots and going till the xylem, so it has to cross the root hairs, then the cortex region, then it has to cross the phloem, then the xylem. So, how do you think that the water after entering the xylem is not able to come out? As it is going in, it can even come out. No, it is not active transport, but there are sealants. You will find that once it has crossed the phloem and then it goes to the xylem. So, now before the phloem there is another layer of cells which have waterproofing mechanism. The water then, it is, when we say semi-permeable, which means it is differentially permeable. So, there the mechanism is selectively going one way transport, it will not allow the water to leak out once it has reached the xylem. In an isotonic solution, nothing would happen because there is no concentration gradient. Both inside and outside, the concentration of the solutes is same. So, now where do you think this active transport? For water, it is mainly diffusion, and then for minerals and salts and for phloem movement of sugars, it is active transport. This is how it takes place in roots. So, it has been absorbed. It can take place through two ways. One is the water can pass through the cells, through the cells and reach the xylem. Another way is the gaps between the cells are utilized to reach till the xylem. So, transport, as we had already discussed, transpiration is one of the ways by which the water is able to flow through the xylem. It creates that negative pressure in the xylem for the water movement to happen. How much percentage of water do you think every day the plant is losing because of transpiration? So, but actually 98% of the water which is absorbed every day is lost. Now, this loss is one, this causes the movement, that is one, and what other advantage do you think this loss, even though it is getting lost, but there is some advantage which is happening. Now, why is water needed by the plant? Photosynthesis, water has to be needed. So, it becomes the bottleneck or the rate limiting step in the photosynthesis, knowing that 98% of the water is getting lost. What can be other additional advantages, not additional, but other advantages which are balancing out this loss? So, one is the mineral transport along with water, not food, but the minerals which are coming along with water. So, they will be pulled up because there is transpiration, so they will be pulled up. This is how it gets transported in the, so the hypothesis which is used to explain the flow of sugar molecules in the sieve tube elements is pressure flow hypothesis. So, as I said, because the xylem is adjacent to phloem, the water molecules diffuse in from the xylem to the phloem at the site of source. So, once it is the source where the sugar is being prepared, so in order for the sugar to move now towards the sink, the hydrostatic pressure is needed. So, for that the water is driven into the sieve tube elements. Now, through the sieve tube elements, then it will pass, and as soon as the site where it has to be downloaded reaches, now the hydrostatic pressure has to be reduced. So, the water is again diffused back into the xylem. So, now tell me which all steps will include active transport in this picture, if you can see. What all steps will have active transport at the site of sink, okay? For what? For the sugar. So, that is also active transport. What else? So, do you think water, what will be the best way, because ultimately the sugar has to be downloaded. Why should the cell spend extra energy doing active transport for all molecules? So, what will it do to automatically take care of the movement of the other entity? It actively transports the sugar molecules into the sink through membrane proteins. The cell membrane, as I said, is permeable to water. So, once the sugar is downloaded, then the water is able to diffuse. So, these things happen in parallel. So, there are membrane proteins, transport proteins, which help in downloading of these cells against these molecules against the concentration gradient. That is called as pressure flow hypothesis. Now, let us talk about the leaves. What is the structure of the leaves? Where does the photosynthesis takes place? As I said, the epidermis is modified. The upper surface of the epidermis is very thin, transparent. You can yourself, I don't know whether you did that experiment. I remember during my 12th standard, we used to peel off the upper layer. So, that used to be transparent. That was the upper epidermis. And then below that, it is your parenchyma cells, modified parenchyma cells, which are the site for photosynthesis. So, the palisade mesophyll and your spongy mesophills. Spongy mesophills, they are randomly arranged, so there are spaces. It is more flexible. The upper layer, which are palisade mesophills, these are again parenchyma cells only, where your light reactions take place, where it gets captured. Now, then in the this spongy mesophyll, there is an area where you see in the veins. Now, these veins are made up of your vascular tissue, your xylem and the phloem. Now, near these xylem and the phloem, adjacent region of the cells is called bundle sheath cells. These are again modified parenchyma cells. Now, these bundle sheath cells are the site for dark reactions or the spongy mesophyll, where the carbohydrates gets formed. Now, see, very nicely nature has made such. Now, the site for carbohydrates or sugars synthesis has been made close to the vascular bundle, so that it can be transported. So, that is a source, and then it has to be transported into the phloem for the movement to different parts of the plant. And your lower epidermis will have openings called stomata. Now, what do you think the plants would do? Plants cannot move. There are seasonal variations, lot of sunlight, sometimes no sunlight. So, how do you think the plants are adapting themselves to cater to their needs of photosynthesis? Too much of sunlight, which means lot of loss of water also. So, at the cost of sunlight capture, there is damage also which is happening. So, then what would the plant do to survive? It will close the stomata. But if it closes the stomata, what will happen? The damage for it, the demerit. It is a merit now. It has closed, no water loss. But now what is the demerit? For photosynthesis, let's stick to photosynthesis. Gas exchange is a demerit. Suddenly CO2 now concentration, how will it capture in the presence of sunlight? We all know it needs CO2 also to synthesize in the dark reactions, convert them into sugars with ATP generated through light reactions, light photons captured. Now once the stomata is closed, what will happen? No CO2 coming in. So inside the cells what will happen? Where these light reactions are happening, the oxygen concentration will rise. So now once the oxygen concentration rises, the enzyme which is responsible for photosynthesis, like dark reactions, is for synthesizing carbohydrates. Do you remember the name of the enzyme? Rubisco. So Rubisco can get activated both ways, by CO2 as well as O2. But we will see later that once the oxygen concentration increases, rather than doing photosynthesis, it becomes, because of higher concentration of oxygen, Rubisco starts acting towards oxygen, starts preferring oxygen rather than CO2, and some other kinds of undesirable then reactions start happening, which is not what the plant or Rubisco is meant to do. So there are different types of plants depending on the regions where they are, where they need to adapt to these situations. These are classed as, generally whatever plants you see, they are C3 class of plants. And the plants in arid regions, these are called as C4 plants. So now in the next class we'll talk about photosynthesis, photorespiration, which is the cause for all this, and then we'll come on to photosynthesis, and then we'll talk about the adaptations into C3 and C4. And even there is a third type from C4, and why does it happen? How does the plant adapt itself to these situations?